am so happy to be here because
No alarms, no screams heard by neighbors, no warning signs that could have saved anyone. Yet by the time the sun rose over Brentwood, Hollywood was already frozen in fear, because inside one of its most protected homes, two lives were gone, and the truth behind it was far darker than anyone was prepared to face. This wasn't a scandal, this wasn't a rumor. This was the kind of silence that only follows something irreversible. Studios went quiet, executives canceled meetings, phones stopped ringing, not because people didn't know what to say, but because they were afraid of what this story revealed. And then something completely unexpected happened. The most private man in Hollywood broke his silence, not through a spokesperson, not through a press release, but personally. And when he spoke, the entire industry realized this was no longer just a tragedy, it was a reckoning. What he revealed wasn't about fame or headlines. It wasn't about damage control or legacy protection. It was about a family that had been quietly breaking apart for years. Hidden behind gates, money, and respect. Behind the polished image, there was pressure. Behind the success, there was fear. And behind unconditional love, there were no boundaries left. According to those closest to him, the night everything changed began like any other long Hollywood evening. A late meeting, bright city lights, a phone buzzing unexpectedly. On the other end of that call were two names, and after those names were spoken, there was silence. The official language was cold and technical, a domestic incident, serious injuries. But those words barely described what investigators actually found. For several minutes after the call ended, he didn't move. He just stared out at the city's skyline, the same city shaped by the very man who was now gone. That was the moment he understood. This wasn't about one night, it was about months, maybe years, because he had seen the warning signs, a private dinner earlier that year, a conversation that suddenly went quiet. A man known for filling every room with energy now was struggling to speak when the topic turned to family. That silence wasn't accidental, it was exhaustion. It was a father carrying a weight he no longer knew how to put down. At the time, no one understood how serious it was. Not fully. Love was still trying to fix everything. Patience was still being stretched, and boundaries were still missing. But pressure doesn't disappear when ignored, it builds. And when it finally breaks, it doesn't break gently. When the arrest came, Hollywood didn't just react, it recoiled. There were no signs of forced entry, no strangers involved, no chaos from outside. This was personal, intimate, deliberate. And that's when the story stopped being about headlines and started becoming something far more uncomfortable. Because this wasn't random violence. This was what happens when love continues without limits, when problems are protected instead of confronted, and when silence is mistaken for compassion. And for the man who finally decided to speak, one thing was clear. This truth could not be buried. Because once the trial begins, lawyers will shape the narrative. Excuses will be offered. Responsibility will be softened. So he spoke now, not for attention, not for sympathy, but because the truth, no matter how painful, was the only way to honor the people who were lost. And this was only the beginning. What haunts him most isn't what happened that night. It's the realization that it didn't come out of nowhere. The tension had been building quietly long before December ever arrived, behind closed doors, inside a home that looked calm from the outside. Pressure had been stacking day after day, the kind that doesn't explode right away. the kind that tightens slowly until breathing becomes difficult. He had noticed the change. Rob wasn't the same man he used to be. The jokes came less often, the confidence felt heavier, and the pauses in conversation grew longer. At one dinner earlier that year, when the conversation turned toward family, Rob didn't speak at all. For a man known for filling silence with warmth, that quiet felt wrong. When he finally did speak, it wasn't casual. The cycle is getting harder to break. Not said like a complaint, not said like frustration, said like a man admitting he was running out of options. Years of a struggle had piled up behind that sentence. Resentment, emotional strain, and conflicts that had grown far beyond normal family disagreements. This wasn't rebellion anymore. This was something deeper. What hurts most is knowing that love was still doing the work alone. Love tried to fix everything. Love kept forgiving. Love kept protecting. But love without boundaries doesn't heal forever. It absorbs damage, and eventually it collapses under its own weight. Looking back, messages that once felt reflective now feel like quiet warnings. A short note about legacy, a comment about the cost of carrying everything alone. At the time, no one thought it meant danger. Now every word feels heavier. When the arrest came, the shock wasn't just about who was taken into custody. It was about what the evidence showed. There were no signs of forced entry, no theft, no outside interference, nothing random. This wasn't chaos, this was personal. Investigators described it as targeted and intimate, the kind of violence that can only happen when trust already exists. And that's when the weight truly hit. This wasn't a stranger crossing a line. This was a line collapsing from the inside. As more details surfaced, the picture became impossible to ignore. The injuries weren't random. They weren't scattered. They showed intensity. They showed buildup. They showed years of emotional pressure finally snapping all at once. And the most devastating detail of all, this didn't end in panic. Whoever walked away that night didn't run. They left calmly. Hours passed while the city stayed alive and glowing, unaware that inside that house, everything had already ended. That image stays with him. A city full of light, a home full of silence. And what breaks him most isn't just Rob. It's Michelle, the quiet balance behind everything, the steady force who stepped in when tensions rose, who absorbed stress so others wouldn't have to, who kept peace when voices got too loud. Learning that she suffered with the same intensity changed everything. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't spontaneous. In his mind, it points to something deliberate, calculated, unsettling. That's why he believes the upcoming trial won't just be legal, it will be emotional in a way Hollywood hasn't faced before. Because once this reaches the courtroom, excuses will be offered, pressure will be blamed, mental strain will be emphasized. But there's one thing he refuses to let disappear: accountability. Rob Reiner, he believes, would have wanted honesty over comfort, even if it hurt. And that belief is why the silence finally broke. Because this story isn't about a scandal. It's about what happens when warning signs are respected too deeply, privacy becomes protection, and love keeps going without limits. And this still isn't the whole truth. What unsettled him most wasn't just what happened inside that house, it was what happened after. While investigators were still piecing together the scene, the city kept moving. Cars passed, lights stayed on. People laughed inside restaurants just miles away. And somewhere out there, the person responsible wasn't hiding. They were moving calmly. According to what he was later told, hours passed before the arrest. Hours where no one knew what had already been done. Security footage surfaced, late-night gas stations, convenience stores, ordinary places where nothing looked out of place. And that's what made it chilling. There was no panic, no urgency, no visible fear, just normal behavior layered over something unspeakable. That detail alone changed how everyone close to the case understood the night. This wasn't an impulsive act followed by regret. It followed a timeline, and timelines imply thought. Investigators confirmed there were no signs of intrusion, no broken windows, no forced doors. Everything pointed inward, toward familiarity, toward trust, toward the moment where hesitation may have existed, the kind that only happens when family's involved. That realization hit hard because it meant the warning signs hadn't been invisible. They had been uncomfortable. And uncomfortable signs are the easiest ones to ignore. As the news spread, Hollywood didn't just react with shock. It reacted with fear. Not fear of scandal, fear of recognition, because behind the gates, guards, and money, many saw pieces of their own lives reflected back at them. Private struggles, protected problems, conversations postponed for later. Hollywood has always known how to protect image, but it has never been good at confronting pain. And this time, silence felt less like respect and more like guilt. As more details surfaced, another truth became impossible to avoid. This wasn't random violence. It was the result of years of pressure colliding with unchecked access, delayed consequences, and the belief that love alone could carry everything. Even now, messages and communications are being reviewed. Words written long before December, revealing isolation, resentment, and a growing desire to escape an identity that felt suffocating. To those who've seen them, the pattern is disturbing. This wasn't confusion, it was direction. And the deeper investigators look, the clearer one thing becomes. This story goes far beyond one family. It exposes a system that rewards silence, delays accountability, and mistakes protection for compassion. And for the man who finally spoke, the hardest truth to accept is this: the people who loved the most were the least protected. 2 lives built on care, patience, and sacrifice, undone not by chance but by something allowed to grow unchecked inside their own home. That's why this trial isn't just about guilt or innocence, it's about responsibility. It's about what happens when everyone sees the strain and no one intervenes. And when the courtroom doors finally open, the story the world hears may sound legal, but the truth behind it is emotional, human, and impossible to ignore, because this wasn't the end of a night. It was the collapse of an illusion. And what comes next will force Hollywood to confront something it's avoided for decades. As the trial date approaches, the city feels different. Not louder, not chaotic, heavier. Behind courthouse walls, lawyers prepare arguments. Language gets polished. Narratives get shaped. Pressure, mental health, stress. Words designed to soften something that refuses to be softened. But what's coming isn't just a legal battle. It's an emotional reckoning, because the evidence doesn't describe panic. It describes sequence. Medical reports point to injuries sustained within minutes. Intense, repeated, deliberate, not random strikes, not a scattered movement, a pattern. And patterns tell stories long before anyone testifies. What stunned investigators most wasn't just the violence itself. It was the aftermath, signs of a movement through the house, attempts to regain control, a transition from a raw emotion to something colder, panic first, then calculation, That shift, that moment, is what changes everything because it suggests awareness, and awareness carries responsibility. Another detail hit even harder. They were found in different parts of the house, separated, unable to reach each other. That single fact turns tragedy into terror. It means confusion, fear, a breakdown of safety in the one place that was supposed to be secure. And for those who knew them, imagining that moment is unbearable. The industry struggles to reconcile it because this wasn't supposed to happen to people like them. Legacy was supposed to protect them. Influence was supposed to shield them. Love was supposed to be enough, but none of it worked. As more testimony looms, former staff members begin coming forward, quietly at first, then formally. Accounts of tension, raised voices, patterns that were minimized because addressing them felt inconvenient. Some describe being paid to leave quietly. Others recall incidents that were smoothed over, not because they were harmless, but because confronting them felt dangerous. That's when the story expands beyond one family. It becomes about a culture that chooses silence over intervention, comfort over confrontation, image over safety. For years, problems were postponed with the belief they could always be fixed later. Later never came. And now that delay has consequences no one can undo. What makes this even harder is the final detail that surfaced. Just an hour before everything ended, the family shared a normal dinner. No shouting, no visible tension, calm. And to him, that's the most chilling part of all, because it proves this wasn't chaos. It was choice. When the courtroom doors open, lawyers will debate intent, but the truth doesn't need interpretation. It's already written into the timeline. And when he speaks now, it isn't to destroy a legacy. It's to protect it, to make sure the people lost aren't rewritten as footnotes in someone else's defense, to make sure love isn't blamed as weakness, because loving without limits wasn't the failure. Ignoring the warning signs was. Hollywood is being forced to face something it has avoided for decades, that behind every perfect image, there can be quiet damage. And when that damage is hidden long enough, it doesn't disappear. It explodes. And when it does, no amount of money, fame, or silence can stop the truth from coming out. This trial won't just decide guilt. It will decide whether the industry finally learns from what it allowed to happen. And for him, one thing is certain. This story cannot end in excuses because the cost was too high and the silence lasted too long. What hurts the most isn't just how this ended, it's how long it was allowed to unfold without being stopped. Because when you strip away the fame, the security, and the illusion of control, what's left is painfully simple. Two people who loved deeply, a family that tried to fix everything quietly, and a system that confused protection with compassion. In the final days before everything collapsed, there were still plans, projects discussed, future ideas shared, conversations about legacy, nothing about fear, nothing about danger. That's what makes this so hard to accept. There was no dramatic warning, no final argument that could be blamed, just normal life until it wasn't. When the truth finally reaches the courtroom, it will arrive dressed in the legal language, timelines, evidence, arguments, but none of that will fully capture what was lost. Because this isn't just about guilt, it's about consequence, about what happens when warning signs are seen but never confronted, when silence feels safer than intervention, when love keeps absorbing damage instead of drawing lines. For the man who chose to speak, this wasn't about reliving pain. It was about refusing to let the story be rewritten, refusing to let excuses replace accountability, refusing to let love be framed as a flaw. He knows once the verdict comes, headlines will fade, but the lesson can't, because behind every gate, every guarded home, and every polished image, there are struggles no one wants to talk about. And pretending they don't exist doesn't make them disappear. It makes them dangerous. This wasn't a failure of love. It was a failure to act when love alone wasn't enough. And if there's one truth this story leaves behind, it's this: silence doesn't protect families, it isolates them. And when isolation lasts too long, the damage becomes irreversible. So as the world watches this trial unfold, the real question isn't just what happened that night. It's how many times similar warning signs are being ignored right now, quietly, comfortably, behind closed doors. Because this story isn't rare. It's just one of the few that finally broke through the silence. And once you see it for what it is, you can't unsee it.